Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. I am the GM Philosopher, and today we are talking about when D&D players don't create backstories. Okay, so first of all, I've got to give a shout out. This video was requested and inspired by Heather Sharrow 5294. I hope I pronounced that right. They left a comment and said, I have an idea for a video. Right now I'm making a new character for a brand new campaign. I'm making this character the daughter of one of my NPCs from the game I ran, which I love. I think that's awesome. I like doing this because it creates a long and in-depth story for me to pull from when role-playing. How do you go about creating backstories that are meaningful for your character? And then the second part of the question is this, and is related to the first. And this is actually more accurately the question I'm going to answer in this video because I think this is a more difficult question. How, as a DM, do you pull in a character who doesn't have a backstory? Do you create one for them as the game progresses? I like to give each player a personal character arc, but that is difficult to do when they don't give you anything to work with. 100% Heather Sharrow 5294. Thank you so much for the question. Awesome question. And hey, right away, I just want to say, if you have a question that you would like me, the GM Philosopher, to answer in a video, drop it in a comment and I will add it to my list. I have a whole list of questions that people have asked me and I'm excited to make them and I will just add it to it. So please drop those requests. And if you have any advice for Heather Sharrow 5294, if you have any ideas, if you have come across the situation, please drop a comment. Let me know how you deal with this. Let me know if you have any advice. I would love to hear the insight and I'm sure that they would as well. One more thing before we dive into it, make sure to give me a thumbs up and a subscribe. Just like a humble character trying to create my own backstory, my little channel has reached 2,000 subscribers and now we are chugging along to 5,000. That is my new goal. So if you will give me that thumbs up and a subscribe, helps my video to get watched by more people, maybe get more subs. This is amazing. Thank you so much in advance. Thank you so much, so much, so much. I love making content about the best game in the world, D&D, and this helps me to get my videos seen by more people, which is awesome. All right, let's dive into this. So how to fix the problem of players not creating backstories. They just throw a character together, show up, no backstory, and want to just start playing. Okay. This is a thing that I have had happen to me, and as probably many GMs can attest to, over and over again. It happened when I was a new GM, and it literally still happens even to this day. Thankfully, I do play with a player group that does a little better with it now, but there are still times when, boom, a player just gets thrown in there. And I'm going to tell you how I deal with this. Okay. First of all, backstory is important. What I think is important to understand is that backstory isn't always 100% important right away. Okay. Now, this is really, that kind of encapsulates my whole philosophy on it. In my games, I have adopted the practice of every player character having their own personal plot arc, exactly like what Heather Sharrow 5294 is talking about here. They said they love to create personal plot arcs for each character. They want to give them one. And for me, this is how the players level up. This is when they accomplish their personal plot arcs. That's how they actually level up. And when one player at the table accomplishes it, one of their personal plot arcs, like their main one, all the other players level up as well. So it's in the group's best interest to pursue these. And I usually let the players choose them. But in order for the players to choose them, they have to have some kind of backstory. Now, here's why I do not always demand a backstory in session one. Let's say, for example, that my session or my campaign is going along. Let's say that we are at level 5 and a player joins. The way that my campaign is set up, it's a little difficult to give the full in-depth, nuanced backstory of the campaign over like Messenger or something like that. A lot of times I will say, hey, create a character. Here are basically the prerequisites. Here's your guide for the gear, for figuring out how much money you have. If you have, any magic items, whatever. Here, basically the list of things, the basic checklist for the construction of the character. And then I'll say, and then I want you to create a sort of vague backstory, but you can leave like locations and things like that sort of empty, because we can go over that when you get here and when you kind of learn the nuanced kind of campaign details. Okay. And I'm totally fine with a player actually just jumping in with a new character with no backstory. We just find a cool way to introduce them and they are mysterious for a minute. Okay. I don't really have any issue with this at all. And part of that reason is because if they're jumping in the middle, there's going to be that time where they're going to need to understand a bit of the context of the world. And it takes me probably 15 minutes to give the spiel about the world state. And I could write it down, and I have in the past written my campaign like world states down. But the thing is that it sort of evolves over time. Like I do have the world state, but then things happen. So giving an up-to-date verbal account of the world state and the situation that the players are in and the situation the world is in, or maybe even just the geographic area, this is very helpful for giving them an up-to-date account of what's actually going on. This seems always more helpful than like just supplying them with something I wrote up at the beginning of the campaign. There's always way more detail that emerges as the game progresses. Part of it is because I create it as the game progresses. So I think that it's really important to understand that players may not always have everything they need to create that backstory in the beginning. Some players also just struggle with backstory, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But let's talk about beginning the campaign. At the very beginning of the campaign, should all players show up with backstory? Yeah, definitely. In fact, I've had situations where I've had players show up and their character had no backstory. And I just took like 10 minutes. I said, hey, okay, let's flesh out some backstory for your character. This is especially true with new players. And I've done this many times. It's like they show up and they have a character. Maybe I even help them create the character because they're brand new to the game. And it's like, okay, let's create you a backstory. I'll sit down and I'll be like, tell me about your character. What kind of person are they? What was their childhood like? What was a big conflict in their life? Tell me about some of their loved ones they've had. Tell me about some of the trauma they've experienced. Tell me about some of the big problems they faced in their life, right? So I want to kind of get a sense. I want to just get them talking about the character. And a lot of times they'll be like, I don't know. And I'll be like, okay, maybe I'll get a table and I'll random roll it. Maybe I will look up something, use Chat GPT, say like, create a backstory for me, create like 10 ideas, let them pick one, right? So I'm going to help lead them. And this is actually something that I will do with players who join partway through as well. Sometimes a player will join partway through the campaign. They don't have a backstory, and I will basically kind of give them the overview, and they'll be like, okay, now I would like you to create me a backstory. Maybe they'll be like, I don't know, or they'll be like, I just don't really know what to say, or maybe they're distracted and they don't really do those types of things on their own. There are some players who don't really work on D&D outside of D&D. There are some players who literally just show up to D&D, pull out their character sheet and be like, I want to play. And maybe they haven't even leveled up, right? They may need help leveling up if they're a new player. Maybe they show up and they don't have any lore for the character, no story, right? So I have always believed that it's part of my job as the GM to help guide these players. And I strongly believe this. There are kind of two types of gamers in this world. There are the like self-sufficient learner gamers, and then there are the casual, they enjoy the drama and they like swinging swords and casting spells gamers who never really invest in the rules of the game or in creating backstories. I had one player who played with me for years. I probably played with him for 7-8 years straight in different games. He was at every single game, every single session, committed role player. He would cause drama. He was great at the table. He did all kinds of awesome things, but he never learned the rules of the game. He never once created a character himself. He would always say, will you create my character for me? Here's what I want. I just want to swing an axe, or, hey, I want a death knight. It's like whatever. And he would ask me to just create him a character. And then every time he was going to level up, people were like, hey, Jim, will you level up my character? I just don't know how to do it. And he just didn't want to do it. And I would do it for him. And the same was true with backstory. He'd be like, I have no idea what I have no idea where to start. And I'd be like, okay, how about this? And I would lay out some ideas. And 9 times out of 10, he'd be like, oh, sounds great. Yeah, I like that. Oh, let's throw this in too. Boom. And he would have like 1 or 2 ideas and it'd be like, boom, write it down. There's your backstory. To me, this was worth the effort because he brought so much to the game and he was so committed to the game and such a fun role player that, for some reason he wasn't interested in like reading the book or managing the character sheet or even writing a backstory. He literally didn't seem to care about those details outside of just knowing what he could throw at enemies, so it's like, and that was fine for me because it was worth the investment, because I thought he was a great player for my table and I liked having him there, right? So it was a good investment. On that same token, sometimes when players show up with no backstory and then you try to get them to have a backstory and they struggle with it, then there's a question of, well, how are they role playing? They might role play amazing and you might think to yourself, I'm going to help them fill out their backstory. Maybe it even emerges throughout the game. Maybe it's never fully fleshed out. sometimes this is the case. Sometimes you give people a player arc and you kind of like have to come up with it despite the fact that their backstory is relatively vague. And if they're a great role player at your table, that might be totally fine. So, what I'm kind of getting at here is this, and I'm going to try to summarize this and kind of break this down into a basic kind of like rule of thumb. Number one, if a player shows up at session one or their session one without a fully fleshed out backstory, there's no problem from me. I don't have no problem with that because they haven't even usually heard the world context yet. Point number two, after their first session, I do want them to choose a story for their character, a background for their character, as good as possible, but I don't place specific requirements. I have had GMs in the past do things like, I'm going to require a 3-page backstory or something like that. I don't do anything like that. I just say, fill it out as best you can. And as long as the backstory gives us enough information to kind of create a player arc and to have a little bit of conflict, and depending on the session, maybe a loved one or two or a contact or two. And then it gives us enough information to kind of just explain why the character is what alignment they are, like the baseline belief system they carry, like the very basics of it. It doesn't even have to be fleshed out. It doesn't even have to be fully figured out. That will happen through the actions of the game, in my opinion. However, we want to have the beginnings of those belief systems located in the character's backstory. And to me, even if a character types up kind of like a half-page history of their character, this helps to answer that. And if they can come up with enough information to kind of basically describe where they've been for their life and what they've done in a very basic manner, then this is usually enough to create a personal story arc. And then the next point would be that me as a GM, if I notice any holes that seem to be lacking in the sense that they hold back everything, then I'm going to step in and help them flesh it out. Sometimes players do need help with it. It can be a challenge to write backstories as a player if you're not like a writer. As GMs, we often find this a fun thing, and we find it a thing that's kind of easy to do because if you are to the point where you are GMing a D&D game, you're probably relatively comfortable with coming up with lore, coming up with stories, coming up with motivations and reasons for why things are the way they are. And this is sort of in the purview of the GM role, but a lot of player characters don't share that same sort of affinity, and to them it can be overwhelming. And so I also like to have some grace in navigating that. So that I hope that does a good job of kind of explaining my approach to when characters don't have backstories and how to deal with it. I always try to operate under the philosophy of here's where we are. Here's what we do know about this character. Let's make this character awesome. Let's throw some awesome situations at them. Let's throw some challenges. Let's throw some moral questions. Let's put them in situations that are going to cause them to have ethical dilemmas. Very quickly, they are going to flesh out their personality. And sometimes for some players, that personality needs to emerge to give them inspiration for the background, which can kind of seem like that can seem counterintuitive sometimes, but I really believe that some players kind of need that, and some players need that help from the GM of filling out the details. So there you go. There are my 2 cents on that. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Let me know about some situations where you have had players come in with characters who have no backstories. How do you work on this? How do you solve it? For me, I just like to hit the ground running and say, let's go, go, go. And let's create as we go. We create as we're playing. We create the past as well as we go. Maybe sometimes a little bit at a time. And that's all I've got for this one. I really appreciate you coming back for another video. Give me a thumbs up and a subscribe. I'm here almost every day. I try to be creating videos about my favorite game in the world, D&D. So I will see you awesome people on the next one.